an anthology of readings of Almighty God's words.
God Himself, the unique Nine. God is the source of life for all things. 3. If all beings lost their own laws, they would no longer exist. If the laws of all beings were lost, then the living beings amongst all beings would not be able to continue on. Humans would also lose their environments for survival that they depend upon for survival. If humans lost all of that, they would not be able to continue to live and multiply generation after generation. The reason humans have survived until now is because God has supplied mankind with all beings to nurture them, to nurture mankind in different ways. It is only because God nurtures mankind in different ways that they have survived until now, that they have survived until the present day. With that type of fixed environment for survival that is favorable and orderly, all kinds of people on the earth, all kinds of races can survive within their own prescribed scopes. No one can go beyond these scopes or these boundaries because it is God that has delineated them. Why would God delineate them this way? This is really important for all of mankind, really important. God delineated the scope for each kind of living being and fixed the survival method for each type of human being. He also divided the different types of people and different races on the earth and fixed their scopes. This is what we want to discuss next. Fourth, God drew boundaries between different races. On earth, there are white people, black people, brown people, and yellow people. These are different types of people. God also fixed the scope for the lives of these different types of people, and without being aware of it, people live within their appropriate environment for survival under God's management. No one can step outside of this. For example, the white race, that is, white people. What areas do they mostly live within? They mostly live in European and American countries. Black people primarily live within Africa. And within what areas do brown people live? Primarily in Southeast Asia, such as Thailand, India, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos. That is, Southeast Asian regions. Yellow people live primarily in Asia, that is, China, Japan, South Korea, and other similar countries. God has appropriately distributed all these different types of races so that these different races are distributed across different parts of the world. In these different parts of the world, God long since prepared an environment for survival suitable for each different race of human. Within these types of environment for survival, God has prepared for them the soil's color and components. The components in white people's bodies and black people's bodies are not the same, and are also different from the components of people's bodies of other colors. When God created all beings, He had already prepared such an environment for survival. His purpose in that was so that when that type of people started to multiply, when they started to increase in number, they could be fixed within that scope. Before God created human beings, He had already thought it all out. He'd give a certain area to white people to allow them to develop and survive. So when God was creating the earth, He already had a plan. He had intention and purpose in what He was putting into that piece of land and what would be nurtured on that piece of land. For example, God long ago prepared what mountains, how many plains, how many water sources, what kinds of birds and beasts, what fish, and what plants would be on that land. When preparing an environment for survival for a type of human being, for a race, God considered many aspects of issues: the geographical environment, the components of the soil, the types of birds and beasts, the size of the various types of fish, the components in the fish, different water qualities, as well as all the different types of plants. God had long ago prepared all of that. That type of environment is a native environment for survival that God created and prepared for white people. You should be able to see that when God created all beings, He put a lot of thought into it. He did things with a plan. Now you can see that, right?
God's considerations for various types of people were very thoughtful. For the environment, for survival, for different types of humans, He prepared the kinds of birds and beasts and the kinds of fish, how many mountains and how many plains there would be. All of it was considered very thoughtfully and precisely.
For example, what food do white people primarily eat?
It's mainly high-protein foods, different types of meat, dairy products, and wheat-based foods.
The foods that white people eat are very different from the foods that Asian people eat. The staple foods that white people eat are primarily meat, eggs, milk, and poultry. Grains, such as bread and rice, are generally non-staple foods that are put to the side of the plate. Even when eating salad, which is made up of vegetables, they put some roasted beef or chicken in it. Even if they eat some wheat-based foods, they add cheese, eggs, or meat to it. That is to say, their staple foods aren't primarily made up of wheat-based foods or rice. They eat quite a lot of meat and cheese. They often drink ice water because they eat really high-calorie foods. When they eat a meal, before the food is served, everyone drinks a glass of ice water first. So white people are really robust. These are the sources for their lives, their environments for living prepared for them by God, allowing them to have that kind of lifestyle. That lifestyle is different from the lifestyles of people of other colors. There is no right or wrong in this lifestyle. It is inborn, predestined by God, and because of God's rule and His arrangements. This type of race has a certain lifestyle and certain sources for their livelihood, which is because of their race, as well as because of the environment for survival prepared for them by God. You could say that the environment for survival God prepared for white people and the daily food they obtain from that environment is rich and plentiful. God also prepared the necessary environments for survival for other races. There are also black people. Where are black people located? They are primarily located in Central and Southern Africa. What did God prepare for them in that type of environment for living? Tropical rainforests, all sorts of birds and beasts, also deserts, and all kinds of plants that go along with them. They have sources for water, their livelihoods, and food. God was not biased against them. No matter what they have ever done, their survival has never been an issue. They also occupy a certain location and a certain area in a part of the world. Now let's talk a bit about yellow people. Yellow people are primarily located in the Orient. What are the differences between the environments and geographical positions of the Orient and the Occident? In the Orient, the majority of the land is fertile, and it is rich in materials and mineral deposits. That is, all sorts of above-ground and underground resources are plentiful. And for this group of people, for this race, God also prepared the corresponding soil, climate, and the various geographical environments that are suitable for them. Although there are great differences between that geographical environment and the environment in the Occident, people's necessary food, livelihoods, and sources for survival were prepared by God. It's just a different environment for living than white people have in the Occident. But what is the one thing that I need to call to your attention, that I need to tell you? The number of the Eastern race is relatively high, so God added a lot of elements in that piece of land that are different from the West. In that part of the world, He added a lot of different landscapes and all kinds of abundant materials. Natural resources there are very abundant. The terrain is also varied and diverse, adequate for nurturing an enormous number of the Eastern race. Something that's different from the West is that in the East, from the South to the North, from the East to the West, the climate is better than the West. The 4 seasons are clearly delineated, temperatures are hospitable, natural resources are abundant, and the natural scenery and types of terrain are much better than in the West. Why did God do this? God created a very rational balance between white people and yellow people. What does this mean? Every aspect of what white people can enjoy is much better than what yellow people are able to enjoy. Their food and the things that they use are much better. However, God is not biased against any race. God gave yellow people a more beautiful and better environment for survival. This is the balance. So now you understand, right? God has predestined which types of people live in which part of the world, and humans cannot go outside of this scope. This is a marvelous thing. Even if there are wars or encroachments during different eras or at particular times, these wars, these encroachments absolutely cannot destroy the environments for survival that God has predestined for each race. That is, God has fixed a certain type of people in a certain part of the world, and they cannot go outside of that scope. Even if people have some kind of ambition to change or expand their territory, without God's permission, this will be very difficult to achieve. It will be very difficult to succeed. For example, white people wanted to expand their territory, and they colonized some other countries. The Germans invaded some countries. England occupied India. What was the outcome? In the end, they failed. What do we see from this failure? What God has predestined is not permitted to be destroyed. So no matter how great the momentum you may have seen in England's expansion, in the end, the outcome is that they still had to withdraw, and that land still belonged to India. Those who live on that land are still Indians, not the English. This is because it's something that God does not allow. Some of those who research history or politics have provided theses on this. They give reasons for why England failed, saying that it could be because a certain ethnicity could not be conquered, or it could be for some other human reason. These are not real reasons. The real reason is because of God. He doesn't allow it. God has an ethnicity live on a certain land and settles them there. And if God doesn't allow them to move, they will never be able to move. If God defines a scope for them, they will live within that scope. Mankind cannot break free or break out of these scopes. This is certain. No matter how great the forces of the encroachers are, or how weak those who are being encroached upon are, their success in the end is up to God. He has already predestined this, and no one can change it. This is how God has distributed the various races. What work has God done to distribute the races? First, He prepared the larger geographical environment, allocating different locations for people, and then generation after generation survive there. This is settled. The scope for their survival is settled. And their diets, their lives, what they eat, what they drink, their livelihoods, God long since settled all of that. And when God was creating all beings, He made different preparations for different types of people. There are different soil compositions, different climates, different plants, and different geographical environments. Different places even have different birds and beasts. Different waters have different types of fish and aquatic products. And even the types of insects are determined by God. For example, there are magpies in Asia, but probably not in the United States. This is very special. And in the US, the sparrows are different from the sparrows in mainland China. The things that grow on the American continent are all very large, very tall, and very robust. The roots of the trees in the forest are all very shallow, but they grow very tall. They can even get as tall as over 100 feet. But the trees in the forests in Asia are mostly not that tall. I'm sure you've all heard of aloe plants. In Japan, they're very narrow, very thin, but the aloe plants in the US are really large. This is different. It's the same type of plant with the same name, but on the American continent, it's relatively large. There really is a difference. The differences in these various aspects may not be seen or perceived by people. But when God was creating all beings, He delineated them and prepared different geographical environments, different terrains, and different living things for different races. Because God created the different types of people, He knows what each of them needs and what their lifestyles are. Thus, what God has created is very good. Now, you should be clear on that. After talking about some of these things, now, do you have some familiarity with the main topic we just discussed? Do you have some understanding of it? There's a reason I've spoken about these things within the broader topic. Now you should have a basic overview of it. You can tell me how much you understood.
All of mankind has been nurtured only by the laws determined by God for all things. When God was determining these laws, He provided different races with different environments, different lifestyles, different foods, and different climates and temperatures. This was so that all of mankind can settle on the earth and survive. From this I can see God's management plan and His meticulous arrangements, as well as His wisdom and perfection.
The laws and scopes determined by God cannot be changed at all by any person, event, or thing. It is all under His rule.
Looking from the perspective of the laws determined by God for the growth of all things, isn't all of mankind, no matter what type, living under God's provisions? Aren't they all living under His nurturing? If these laws were destroyed, or if God hadn't established these kinds of laws for mankind, what would their prospects be? After humans lost their basic environments for survival, would they have any source of food? It's possible that food sources would become a problem. If people lost their sources of food, that is, they can't get anything to eat, possibly they wouldn't be able to hold on for even a single month. People's survival would become a problem. So every single thing that God does for people's survival, for their continuing existence and multiplication, is very important. Every single thing that God does among all things is closely related to and inseparable from people's survival. It is inseparable from their survival. If mankind's survival became a problem, could God's management continue on? Would God's management still exist? So God's management coexists with the survival of all mankind, who He nurtures. And no matter what God prepares for all things and what He does for humans, this is all necessary for Him, and it is critical for mankind's survival. If these laws that God determined for all things were departed from, if these laws were broken or disrupted, all things would no longer be able to exist. Mankind's environment for survival would not continue to exist, and neither would their daily sustenance, and neither would they. For this reason, God's management of mankind's salvation would no longer exist either. This is something that people must see clearly. Everything that we've discussed, every single thing, every item is intimately linked to the survival of every single person. You might say, "What you're talking about is too big. We can't see it." And perhaps there are people who would say, "What you're talking about has nothing to do with me." However, do not forget that you are living as just a part of all things. You are a member of all things within God's rule. All things cannot be separated from God's rule, and not a single person can separate themselves from His rule. Losing His rule and losing His provisions would mean that people's lives in the flesh would disappear. This is the importance of God establishing environments for survival for mankind. It doesn't matter what race you are or what piece of land you live on, be it in the West or the East, you cannot separate yourself from the environment for survival that God has established for mankind. And you cannot separate yourself from the nurturing and provisions of the environment for survival He has established for humans. No matter what your livelihood is, what you rely on to live, and what you rely on to sustain your life in the flesh, you cannot separate yourself from God's rule and His management. Some people say, "I'm not a farmer. I don't plant crops for a living. I don't rely on the heavens for my food, so I can say that I am not surviving in the environment for survival established by God." That kind of environment hasn't given me anything. But this isn't right. And why not? You say that you don't plant crops for your living, but don't you eat grains? Don't you eat meat? Don't you eat eggs? Don't you eat vegetables and fruit? Everything that you eat, all of these things that you need, are inseparable from the environment for survival established by God for mankind. And the source of everything that mankind requires cannot be separated from all things created by God, these kinds of environments for survival. The water you drink, the clothing you wear, and all the things that you use, which of these is not obtained from among all things? Some people say, there are some items that aren't obtained from all things. Like what? Give me an example. Some say, you see, plastic isn't obtained from all things. It's a chemical thing, a man-made thing. But this isn't right. Why not? Plastic is man-made. It is a chemical thing. But where did the original components of plastic come from?
They came from the things originally created by God.
The original components were obtained from materials created by God. The things that you enjoy, that you see, every single thing that you use are all obtained from all things which have been created by God. That is to say, no matter what race, no matter what livelihood, or in what type of environment for survival people live, they cannot separate themselves from God's provisions. So are these things that we've discussed today related to our topic of God is the source of life for all things? So do the things we've discussed today fall under this larger topic? It's only because of this relationship that I've said all of this. Perhaps some of what I've talked about today is a bit abstract, and it's a little difficult to discuss. However, I think that you probably understand it a little better now. These last few times in fellowship, the range of the topics that we've had fellowship on is rather broad, and their scope is wide, so it takes some effort for you to take it all in. This is because these topics are things that haven't been encountered before in people's belief in God. Some people hear it as a mystery, and some people hear it as a story. Which perspective is right? From what perspective do you hear all of this?
We have seen God's actions, as well as how methodically He has arranged all things, and that all things have these laws, and through these words, we can understand more of God's actions and His meticulous arrangements for saving mankind.
Through these times in fellowship, have you seen what the scope of God's management of all things is?
All of mankind. Everything.
Is God the God of one race? Is He the God of one type of people? Is He the God of a small portion of mankind?
No, He's not.
Since that's not the case, in people's knowledge of God, if He were only the God of a small portion of mankind, or if you believe that God is only your God, is this perspective correct? Since God manages and rules over all things, people should see His actions, His wisdom, and His almightiness that are revealed in His rule over all things. This is something that people must know. If you say that God manages all beings, rules over all beings, and rules over all of mankind? But if you don't have any understanding of or insight into his rule over mankind, can you really acknowledge that he rules over all things? Can you? You may think in your heart, I can, because I see that this life of mine is all ruled by God. But is God really that small? He's not. You only see God's salvation for you and his work in you, and from these things you see his rule. That is too small of a scope, and it has an impact on your genuine knowledge of God. It also limits your genuine knowledge of God's rule over all things. If you limit your knowledge to the scope of what God provides for you and his salvation for you, you will never be able to recognize that he rules over everything, that he rules over all things, and rules over all of mankind. When you fail to recognize all of this, can you truly recognize the fact that God rules over your fate? You can't. In your heart, you will never be able to recognize that aspect. You will never be able to recognize that level. You understand, right?
Yes.
Actually, I know to what degree you are able to understand these topics, this content that I'm talking about. So why do I keep talking about it? It is because these topics are things that must be understood by every single follower of God, every single person who wants to be saved by God. They must know of these topics. Even though at this time, at this moment, you don't understand them, someday, when your life and your experience of the truth reach a certain level, when your change in your life disposition reaches a certain level, and your stature increases to a certain degree, these words, these topics that I'm communicating to you in fellowship, only then will they truly provide for and satisfy your pursuit of knowledge of God. So these words were to lay a foundation to prepare you for your future understanding that God rules over all things, and for your understanding of God himself. However much understanding of God there is in people's hearts determines how much of a position he holds in their hearts. However great the degree of knowledge of God is in their hearts, is how great his status is in their hearts. If the God that you know is empty and vague, then the God in your heart is also empty and vague. If the God that you know is limited within your own scope, then he is a very small God. That God is not connected to the true God and has nothing to do with him. Thus, knowing God's actual actions, knowing the reality of God and his omnipotence, knowing the true identity of God himself, knowing what he has and is, knowing what he has demonstrated among all things, these are very important to every single person who pursues knowledge of God. These are inseparable from every person's life, from every person's practical life of pursuit of the truth. If you limit your understanding of God to just words, if you limit it to your own little experiences, God's grace that you count, or your little testimonies to God, then I say that your God absolutely is not the true God. He absolutely is not the true God himself. And it can also be said that the God you believe in is not God. This is because the God that I am speaking of is the one that rules over everything, that walks among everything, that manages everything. He is the one that holds the fate of all of mankind, the one that holds the fate of everything. The work and actions of the God that I am talking about are not just limited to a small portion of people. That is, it's not limited to just the people who currently follow him. His actions are demonstrated among all things, in the survival of all things, and in the laws of change of all things. If you cannot see or recognize any actions of God among all things, then you cannot bear witness to any of his actions. If you cannot bear any witness for God, if you continue to speak of the small, so-called God that you know, that God who is limited to your own ideas and is within your narrow mind, if you continue to speak of that kind of God, then God will never praise your faith. When you bear witness for God, if you only use how you enjoy God's grace, accept God's discipline and his chastening, and enjoy his blessings in your witness for him, that is hugely inadequate and is far from satisfying him. If you want to bear witness for God in a way that is in line with his will, bear witness for the true God himself, then you must see what God has and is from his actions. You must see God's authority from his control of everything, and see the truth of how he provides for all of mankind. If you only acknowledge that your daily food and drink and your necessities in life come from God, but you don't see the truth that God provides for all of mankind by means of all things, that he leads all of mankind by means of his rule of all things, then you will never be able to bear witness for God. Now you understand all of this, right? What's my purpose in saying all of this? It's so that you don't take this lightly, so that you don't believe that these topics I've spoken about are irrelevant to your own personal entry into life, and so that you don't take these topics as just a type of knowledge or doctrine. If you listen to this with that kind of attitude, you won't gain a single thing. You will lose this great opportunity to know God. So you understand now? What is my goal in talking about all of these things? My goal is to have people know God, to have people understand God's practical actions. Once you understand God and you know his actions, only then do you have the opportunity or the possibility to know him. If, for example, you want to understand a person, how would you understand them? Would it be through looking at their outward appearance? Would it be through looking at what they wear, how they dress up? Would it be through looking at how they walk? Would it be through looking at the scope of their knowledge? It certainly wouldn't be. So how do you understand a person? You make a judgment through a person's thoughts, through their speech and behavior, through what they express and what they reveal. This is how you know a person, how you understand a person. Likewise, if you want to know God, if you want to understand his practical side, his true side, you must know him through his actions, and through every single practical thing that He does. This is the best way, and it is the only way. So do you understand now? God manifests His actions among all things, and among all things He rules over and has hold of the laws of all things. It is utterly necessary for people to understand and know God